Moving on from gross to net exploding, we're now going to talk about lead time offsetting. And this is a continuation from our title here, Integrating Sales and Operations Planning, MPS, MRP, Inventory Management, and Logistics. As the name would indicate, lead time offsetting is just that, being in a position to place purchase orders for raw materials at a time that is synchronized with as close to when we need that as possible. So orders, and we're talking about purchase orders here for raw materials, are placed for product on a date that offsets cumulative lead times. And we defined cumulative lead times earlier, so that should be fairly clear. We'll continue to add meaning to cumulative lead time, but should be pretty straight for now. So we're trying to offset the date that we place a purchase order with the desired date of receipt. One of the important things we need to know, obviously, are what of the components of that cumulative lead time. And in our sub-bullet points, we can point some of those up. So the time it takes to prepare a purchase order and a vendor overseas to accept it. The vendor overseas, of course, has to go into production themselves, perhaps even procure raw materials if they are in a build-to-order environment. So we have to know that production time. Transportation lead time, especially in an international environment, very important. Distinction between simple things or seemingly simple things like, do we use ocean transportation or air freight? Obviously going to impact our lead time as well. Customs clearance time can be anything from a matter of hours to a matter of days, depending on the complexity or perhaps any issues with the customs clearance itself. And then domestic distribution. So lead time offsetting combined with gross to net exploding emphasizes an element of quantities and in what time periods, and the lead time. When do we have to place orders for the quantities that we desire? Second bullet point, that lead time offsetting, it has to be integrated with the logistics function. Much of what we're talking about in terms of what constitutes cumulative lead time are logistics functions. International transportation, customs clearance, domestic distribution, those are all clearly logistics-related functions, and we have to integrate with the MRP function and purchasing colleagues to make sure that things work right. Integration, always achieved on a human level, but also through process design that we've talked about and will continue to elaborate on, as well as supply chain software applications. There are many, many software applications that help to manage the MRP process, which in essence is made up of gross to net exploding and lead time offsetting. Just as we saw with our sales and operations planning definition, we moved from a prose-based explanation to a more visual explanation, and that's precisely what we're going to do here, albeit in an MRP type of scenario. So what we're looking at is a really important slide, and we'll see it multiple times throughout our modules. So if it seems a little confusing at the beginning, not to worry, because we will continue to explain and elaborate and use examples. But what we're looking at here, as the title indicates, is what's called a software-based MRP item table, Material Requirements Planning Item Table. And in the software world, and certainly in our supply chain world, every item that we purchase, raw materials overseas or finished products, if we're a product wholesaler, for example, within software is going to have an item table that is dedicated specifically to that item, whether it's a pair of sneakers or a widget that goes into a production process. And it helps us to manage the elements of gross to net exploding and lead time offsetting. We are committed to this idea of gross to net exploding and lead time offsetting. So in the body, what we're looking at here, let's start with on the upper left-hand side. We just randomly named our item. It's a widget that goes into a production process, the ABC item. We have an order quantity that we'll talk about how to determine order quantities later on of 1,000. And lead time, very important. We start to see that lead time offsetting component. In this case, a simple scenario of 2 weeks. In the middle here, we're talking about time buckets or time periods, which are usually for a week, and then the various steps that go on, and we'll elaborate on them in just a moment, out into different time periods. Early time periods, week 1, week 2, week 3. and all the way perhaps out into a 52-week period. But before we go into the details of the table itself, let's have a quick look at an even further explanation down here on the lower left-hand side. So based on our master production schedule, bill of material, that recipe for a given product, and available inventories, what we have on hand now for item ABC, our MRP software is going to net, offset, explode requirements, and create planned order releases. Now that's quite a bit of information there. So let's stop for a second and talk about that. Beginning back with our product forecast that drives much of our sales and operations planning activities, we said that forecasts are replaced by actual business activities where we receive orders from customers. Clients buy our product and we make adjustments. Well, those adjustments come in the form of the master production schedule. To start with, if we're getting more orders from a customer, we have to up our production. That's an adjustment. And we have to figure out in each time period, again, what those adjustments are going to have to be. So really what we're saying is, starting to look towards our graphic here, that in each period we're going to have a gross requirement. At the very beginning, what we think we're going to need, what the system is telling us we're going to need for, in this case, our raw material ABC. However, in the business world, it's almost always going to be the case that we're going to have some inventory of item ABC on hand already. So whereas the production schedule might be telling us that we need 1,000 units of item ABC in period 1, if we have 500 units laying about, what we really need, what our net requirement is actually 500. So that's where this idea of gross to net exploding comes in. What we think we're going to need, what we're planning in gross requirements for each period, netted by what we have on hand, or what is oftentimes referred to as projected available, as well as things like scheduled receipts, as we see here. So it's not only what we have on hand, but what we know relatively for sure that is coming in. And those figures are going to be displayed here. So when we talk about netting, gross to net exploding, we're subtracting in essence. So netting equals subtracting in this particular example. What are we subtracting? Well, we have a gross requirement that based on our master production schedule says we're going to need, let's continue with that 1,000 unit need in week 1. Well, if we have 500 on hand, as we saw here, and let's say we have another 250 coming in that same time period, our net requirement is going to be 250. This is what we have to plan to acquire based on what's going on in this time period now. The point is that as we move further out into our time periods, things are definitely going to change. We're going to receive hard orders from customers. We're going to have clients maybe walk into a store if we're a big box retailer and actually buy goods. So that forecast is going to be replaced, or what is called consumed, by the actual sales activities going on in our model. Again, it could be a big box retailer, or we're a manufacturer. It all depends, but the fact is that our forecast, because it's never right, as we've stated previously, is indeed going to change. We have to make adjustments, and that's what sales and operations planning is. On the buy side of sales and operations planning, that all revolves around materials planning, and in today's software-based world, thank goodness, it's driven by algorithms that take into account gross requirements, net out what we have in play already, get to a net requirement, and then we can plan, moving further out into the future even more, for planned order receipts and planned order releases. Planned order releases become very important because as we go further out into time periods beyond or out into a 52-week period, that's what we're planning to release out into the future, actual purchase orders on vendors. That will indeed change. That is the ultimate manifestation of how forecasts are never 100% correct. So the adjustments that we've been talking about in sales and operations planning, closely linked to gross to net exploding and lead time offsetting, manifest themselves here in the buy side of our sales and operations planning activity. So going to our last sentence here, we didn't quite finish up, but as actual activity, as I said, consumes the forecast, we're replacing a forecast with actual goings on, actual sales. Our algorithms in the software automatically cascade updates to the MRP product records. Make more, don't make more, buy more, don't buy more, place orders earlier, increase an order, or even cancel an order. That's what we're talking about. And the software will tell the buyer, the purchasing agent, for every single item that that buyer is responsible for, what they need to do. Ultimately, all software has an element of human judgment, and the system can be overridden by that human judgment. But to reiterate, buy-side activities, adjustments in sales and operations planning as it relates to gross to net exploding and lead time offsetting is all done in this type of environment here. The key, of course, is when the software world meets the real world and you have to make those things happen. But for now, I think first pass, good explanation. We'll see it again and again, so we will make it clearer as we go. Let's move on.